My name is Lucy, and I'll be reading Mark chapter 15, 1 through 15. And if you don't have a Bible, you can feel free to take the one in the chair in front of you, and that's our gift to you. And as soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." And the chief priests accused him of many things. And Pilate again asked him, "Have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so that Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of the envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. This is the word of the Lord.
Good morning, New King Church. My name is Tyler Twombly. I am one of the pastors here. I am excited to preach to you from Mark chapter 15, a chapter that I hope gives us some sense of comfort and conviction at the same time upon seeing Jesus. If you're new here, I'd love to talk to you afterwards if I don't get a chance. We're glad that you're here, and we're glad to study the Word together. I hope each of you have had a good weekend. It's a beautiful Vermont day, and by that I mean it's typical cloudy, rainy, and cold. It's beautiful. I love it. Yesterday we made a snowman. That was pretty fun. It hasn't been good snow for snowmen yet in Milton, where I live. We made a snowman. My kids named him Shovel. They're not very creative with names, and I would tell them that to their face. I'm excited to bring to you the word of the Lord from Mark chapter 15 today. Before I do that, let me pray, and then we'll dive in. Lord, I thank you so much for this day, a day that is beautiful not because of the weather or the circumstances in our life, but because every day is beautiful where we get to study your word. Help us, Lord, to focus our hearts and our minds on the truth that you have to give to us today. Help us to recognize the willing sacrifice that you offered and the willing suffering that you came to endure. Help us be encouraged in the midst of our own suffering. Not that we're alone, but we have a high priest who understands and knows. Lord, I pray for myself that you would give me humility and boldness to preach your word today. I'm not a perfect person, Lord, but use my imperfect words to preach your perfect truth. And Lord, I pray for anyone who is here today to hear the gospel for the very first time, that upon seeing the holiness, the character of Jesus on display, they would desire to put their trust in him and his work on their behalf. I thank you, Lord, for this day. I pray these things in your name. Amen. If you're new here, we go through books of the Bible verse by verse, and for the last little over a year or so, we've been in the Gospel of Mark. I hope you'll look there with me as we'll study today from Mark chapter 15. Where we have been for the last several months is kind of going through Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem, which is on the later mid-half of the Gospel of Mark from chapter 11 onwards. Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem primarily is in chapters 11 through 13. And what he does and says there ultimately leads to the religious leaders desiring to kill Jesus. Now, in the midst of their planning, Jesus reveals through establishing the Lord's Supper or communion that we take every Sunday, that ultimately why he's going to die is not by his own lack of planning, but actually because of his sovereignty and control, that he's going to willingly suffer and die for not only his disciples, but all who would desire to become his disciples. He then goes and prays in a garden called Gethsemane, where he experiences just a taste of the suffering he will endure in the next couple chapters. While he's there, one of his own disciples brings a mob of people to come and carry him away to the Sanhedrin. That's the religious leaders of Israel. This Judas leads Jesus to the Sanhedrin for a few pieces of silver. The Sanhedrin falsely puts Jesus on trial. They present false witness about him, and actually all of their witness contradicts, which is kind of interesting. But in the end, they decide, we will kill Jesus. And in the midst of that, he is being denied by one of his own disciples, Peter, just outside that moment. Where we're going is right before you in this slide. Where we're going is in chapter 15 and the beginning of 16. So today we will study Jesus being tried and delivered. I'm glad I spelled that right on the slide. Delivered. That'll be in Mark chapter 15, verses 1 through 20. And then Jesus next week will be crucified, and I'll preach that sermon as well. And then Jesus will talk about his death and burial in Mark 15, 33 through 47. Pastor Nathan will come up and preach that for you guys. And then we will preach just the first 8 verses of chapter 16, and that is Jesus' resurrection. So that is where we're going over the next couple weeks. We will end on Easter Sunday. I mean, what better day to talk about the resurrection, right? What I love about these verses that we're studying today is the interaction Jesus gets to have with Pilate. Now, the reason I think this is so cool is because I'm going to take my pastor hat off and put my nerd hat on. Now, typically that's the same hat, but I try not to show it when I'm preaching. But I think these verses are really cool because of Jesus' conversation with Pilate. The reason I think this is so cool is because very recently I learned about this. There's a guy named Wes Huff. Some of you may have heard of him. He is kind of an aspiring Bible scholar and a leader of a group called Apologetics Canada. He's very smart, very intelligent. He knows the Bible really well. You should go watch his videos. He was on one of the world's foremost podcasts. It's called the Joe Rogan Experience. I am not advocating you should go listen to Joe Rogan necessarily. I realize he's probably considering this free publicity, but anyways. So Wes Huff, a Christian, goes on a non-Christian's podcast. This is one of the biggest podcasts in the world, and Wes Huff gets to talk about what it really means to know Jesus, to follow Jesus, how we can trust what the Bible says. It's amazing. In the midst of this conversation, Wes Huff gifts Joe Rogan a piece of, I don't know how to say this, a piece of Greek literature. So these are the pictures that we'll show on the screen today, if you can see them. So basically, in these pictures that you see is an old Greek manuscript. Now, this is the original. You can actually find this on the Center for Study of the New Testament Manuscripts. It's a free website. You can look it up and find it. So none of this is like special information or anything. But basically what Wes Huff does is he copies what this looks like and makes it into what it would look like if it were real. So he gives it to Joe Rogan. And why does this even matter? Why am I telling you about this? It's because this manuscript is called P52. This is one of the oldest Greek manuscripts for the Gospel of John, and it's actually one of the parallel texts to what we're studying today. What's different, though, is that from what we're studying today, John adds a theological discussion, and that is what is in the picture. In the theological discussion, Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you king of the Jews?" Jesus says, "I'm a king, but not like a king you have ever met before. My kingdom is not of this world." And Pilate's like, what does that mean? I don't understand. And Jesus says, "For this reason I have come to bear witness to the truth." And Pilate's question in P52 is, what is truth? What is truth? And so Wes Huff goes on Joe Rogan's podcast, and he gives him the manuscript, not just to say, hey, this is what it would look like, but to ask Joe Rogan, what is truth? In the same way, when we study these verses today, Mark has been wanting you to ask and answer the question, who is Jesus? He's been giving you all of this information about Jesus' life and his ministry, but not for no reason at all. It's not like he's just trying to write something with historical information. But instead, he's writing something to get you, his reader, to be able to answer who is Jesus. And so just like Pilate is trying to judge Jesus, you and I, in a similar way, are judging Jesus and trying to answer the same question, what is truth? Our society and our culture has many answers to this question, but there are no answers more important than what you do with the truth about Jesus. With that in mind, what is the truth we will be studying today? Here is my main idea. I call it the main idea of the verses. That's not new to me. I got that from seminary classes. But this is the MIV, the main idea of the verses. Jesus is the one true Son of the Father, the King of the Jews, who suffered in our place. That's the truth we will study today. Jesus is the one true Son of the Father, the King of the Jews, who suffered in our place. In order to prove this to you, here's how Mark, I think, organizes the verses. So here's how we're going to study this today. Jesus tried and delivered. Sorry, this is that's the older slide. I'll just tell you what my outline is for today. It's Jesus and Pilate in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 15. Jesus and Pilate. And then the second section is Jesus and Barabbas. Now, Jesus isn't really interacting with Barabbas, but there's an important comparison in the middle of these verses. So Jesus and Barabbas. And then last is Jesus and the soldiers. Jesus and the soldiers, that's verses 16 through 20. So again, Jesus and Pilate, verses 1 through 5. Jesus and Barabbas, verses 6 through 15. And then Jesus and the soldiers in verses 16 through 20. If you'll look with me at verse 1 of Mark chapter 15, hear from the word of the Lord. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council. And they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Now, remember what we studied previously is that the Sanhedrin, the most important religious figures in Israel, have put Jesus on Jewish trial. What they're trying to convict him of is blasphemy. So effectively taking the Lord's name in vain, but more than that, saying that he is the Lord. They're trying to get him to say something that all the Jews would be like, we're against that guy. You can't commit blasphemy. You're not God. We're going to kill you because of it. Now, if that's true, if Jesus is not God and he's committing blasphemy, the Old Testament punishment is that Jesus should die. So they're not necessarily wrong in that, but they have false intentions. On top of that, there has been enough that they have witnessed about Jesus' life to be able to decide to declare Jesus is God. And so it's not blasphemy if he's really God. The problem is because of their false intentions, they don't really care what Jesus' real identity is. They would prefer to kill him and get rid of him so they can remain in power. The problem, though, is that the Jews had no authority under Roman rule to kill somebody. So when it says, and it was morning, that's actually kind of an important indicator. Jesus has gone through the entire night on trial before the Jewish council, but they can't kill him, so they have to wait until the break of dawn to take him before Pilate. That was when their office hours were. As around 8:30, 8 a.m., you were like, okay, let's bring in whomever needs to be on trial, and then the Romans will try him and decide if they can kill him. So they held consultation with the elders and scribes, the whole council. They bound Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Now, who is this Pilate character? No, he's not like a pilot in the sense that he flies planes or he captains a ship or anything like that. Pilate's just his name. He was a magistrate, a governor over Judea from about AD 26 to AD 36. That's important for us as we try to identify when was it that Jesus lived. So we know up to this point he's living somewhere between AD 26 to AD 36. Pilate is specifically noted in history as being very harsh, cruel, and actually antagonizing the Jewish people. There are many times where they would protest against him, and he would send people out to beat them or kill them or whatever he would decide. So he was a harsh and a cruel man. However, he also has moments where he would make promises in order to keep the peace and stay in good relationship with Rome. So he likes his position, he likes his seat of power. Sometimes he will do things to satisfy the people in order to give the false impression things are under control. And we see all of those things in display in this passage. He's somewhat interested in what the Jewish council has to say about Jesus, but more than that, he's interested in how the people react to his decision making. So while he would like to remain in power, he likes that they're coming to him, he also is tempted to give in at the slightest pressure by the crowd. So now, what exactly happens? Pilate follows up in verse 2. Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" This is important for you and I, as Pilate he does not care about Jesus if he's not claiming to be king of the Jews. There is no situation where Jesus is brought to Pilate and doesn't think he's king. This is the thing that makes Jesus most interesting to Pilate. Because Pilate knows if this guy is claiming to be king, he wants to supersede Roman authority. And then we've got to kill him. We've got to make an example of him. So that's why Pilate asked this question. It's not just because the Jewish council is proposing this. It's because that's really all that Pilate has to go on for weight in the discussion. So he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And here is how Jesus responds. Jesus says, "You have said so." This is an interesting reply by Jesus. Now, as a married man, I would just say it is unwise to respond to something your wife says with saying, "You have said so." Sounds pretty prideful, if I would say so. And I would die if I said that, just honestly. But Jesus, here's what Jesus is doing. Jesus is placing the decision in Pilate's hands. He's placing the weight of the conversation in Pilate's hands. He says, "You have said so." So there's two sides to this. Jesus is not claiming to be king of the Jews in the way that Pilate has asked the question. The flip side, though, is that Jesus has not denied it. Jesus has not gone and said, "I'm not king of the Jews. I have no interest in that. That's really not for me. I like being a traveling preacher. I like kind of this itinerant ministry I have." He doesn't say that. Instead, he says, "You have said so." So in some way, Jesus is acknowledging he's king of the Jews. But ultimately, he's saying, what are you going to do with the answer if that's true? So he's trying to force Pilate to think about, if Jesus really is king of the Jews, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my decision making? Now, each of you should recognize your place in this. You are Pilate in the reading of Mark's gospel, where each of us wants to know, well, that's actually an interesting question. What is Jesus' opinion about being king of the Jews? Jesus, are you king of the Jews? Jesus says, "You have said so." So what will you, the audience, do with Jesus' neutral answer? You have read Mark up to this point. You have seen all of the things Mark says about Jesus' life, but what does that mean for you if it's true? An interesting reality in these verses is that when Jesus says these things to Pilate, he is turning Pilate from being the judge to now being the accused. Where Pilate has come to accuse and interrogate Jesus, Jesus, by his response, now says he's the one in judgment over Pilate. And what Pilate says, what he does with the information, matters. Because like Jesus acknowledges in the previous passage, they will see the Son of Man coming to judge in power and glory. That is the same for Pilate. One day he too will be judged based on his answer of the identity of Jesus. What will he do? Pilate comes back to Jesus and says, in verse 3, the chief priests accused Jesus of many things, and Pilate again asked him, have you no answer to make? See how many charges they bring against you. So the chief priests come and they continue to accuse Jesus. Pilate's like, come on, man, have an answer. You got to do more than what you've said. But it says in verse 5, Jesus made no further answer, and Pilate was amazed. Now, these things are in fulfillment with Isaiah 53, verse 7, which says that the sheep, or this Son of Man, this character, this coming Messiah, was oppressed and afflicted, yet did not open his mouth. Like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter. In the same way, Jesus is that sheep. He is the coming Messiah, and yet he remains silent. Can you imagine how hard it is, maybe for each of us, when we're accused or told to do something that we didn't actually do? How often is it that we want to quickly respond and defend ourselves? And yet Jesus remains silent. It says Pilate was amazed. Now, this happens many times in the Gospel of Mark. It does not mean that Pilate actually believes in Jesus. Rather, Pilate is just left stunned. The character of Jesus on display, and yet all that has been provoked is an emotional response, but not action. What will you do with what Jesus has said? Now, Mark continues into the next section. So we just saw Jesus talking with Pilate. Some important things before we move on. Each gospel has a little bit of a different account, or not different in the sense that there's different information, but they emphasize different aspects. In Matthew 27, chapter 27, 1 through 31, the Pharisees claim he's the Christ, the King of the Jews. So that kind of shows the Pharisees don't quite understand the Christ to be the same as what it really means. They think that Christ is this coming king coming to conquer Rome. So they're using that title against Jesus rather than believing in him. In the same chapter, Matthew 27, Pilate's wife has a dream, which is in parallel with the verses we're about to study. She says, I don't like this. You should not deal with this man. And so Pilate washes his hands. He shows he's clean of what happens to Jesus. In Luke's gospel, Jesus is interrogated by the evil king Herod Antipas, and yet he does not speak a single word to the man who killed John the Baptist. In John chapter 18, 33 through 38, we've already discussed, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. I've come to bear witness to the truth, and all who believe in me follow me. So it leaves Pilate with a decision to make. What will he do? Mark moves on to that decision. Here it says in verse 6, this is Jesus and Barabbas. Now at the feast, he used to release for one of them a prisoner for whom they asked, and among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually does. Now, there's several interesting things here, but there actually is no historical record or anything outside the scriptures that something like this happened all the time. I mean, sometimes at different feasts, people would be released or they would be freed from their charges, but it's not like a specific thing that happens during the Passover. So this is very, very unique. But apparently, occasionally, people will be released during feasts, celebrations, and so the Jewish people are asking for the same thing to happen. And among the rebels in prison is a man who wanted to lead this freedom fighters group against the Romans. This freedom fighter was named Barabbas. Now, the meaning of Barabbas is very important. I think there's two things you need to know about this. Is one, the meaning is important, but number two, this is a real person. So I don't want to just say the meaning of his name is greater than what his real name is. I think it's both. So in both what his name means and in this person, his name is Barabbas. Barabbas means son of the Father. Means son of the Father. And from the other Gospels, we actually find out that his given name was Jesus. So an interesting comparison happens for Pilate and for the Jewish people. Will you pick Jesus, son of the Father, a rebel, an insurrectionist, or will you pick Jesus, the one true Son of the Father, who has come to suffer for you? They are faced with an impossible decision. Which Jesus will they choose? In the same way, this is amazing, and this is why the Bible's incredible. Which Jesus will you, the audience sitting here today, choose? Will you choose your own Barabbas, which in this case really would be yourself, your opinions, and your pride? Or will you pick Jesus, who was silent amongst his accusers, like a sheep led to the slaughter in humility? Who will you follow? Upon being given this decision, Pilate responds in verse 9. He answered them, "Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews?" So again, he acknowledges there's this public image being portrayed of Jesus, the King of the Jews. He said, "For he perceived it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up." Now, this actually is a moment where Pilate is using good foresight. He understands why the chief priests have really brought Jesus to him. It's not because Jesus is claiming to be something he's not, because it's obvious from here and the other Gospels in comparison, Jesus has not claimed to be the king that Pilate would need to kill. In fact, there's really nothing about Jesus' life that makes Pilate want to say, I should convict this man and kill him. But he understands the other men are jealous. They're jealous of Jesus, his status, and his popularity. So he says, "Do you really want me to give you the King of the Jews?" But the chief priests, it says in verse 11, stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the King of the Jews?" So again, Pilate's like, all right, what do you guys want to do? So he's trying to absolve himself from a decision. He's trying to play neutral, not realizing the decision he really should make. And the crowd screamed. They cried out, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" See, Pilate, while not generally being self-aware, is aware enough in this moment to understand Jesus hasn't done anything wrong. They shouted all the more, "Crucify him." And so Pilate, this is the moment where he really decides. Wishing to satisfy the crowd, he released for them Barabbas. And it says, having scourged Jesus. Now this is interesting. The other Gospels help us understand it was Pilate who did the scourging. He was as much a part of what happens to Jesus in his suffering and in his abuse. Pilate turns from a neutral party now to an aggressor. He scourged Jesus and had him delivered to be crucified. Now, I think something very important is the testimony of Peter in 1 Peter chapter 2 and chapter 3. Throughout this moment, we see that Pilate has a decision to make. He wants to make the crowd make the decision in the end. He makes the decision himself only to satisfy the crowd. And in fact, he also tries to satisfy his relationship with Herod Antipas, the evil king. So he's trying to maintain his balance between two differing sides, the Jewish people and the Romans, who both have come together to inflict imminent pain and suffering on the one man, Jesus. They are not interested in each other's success, but they are interested in working together to kill Jesus. Before you would think why Jesus dies is merely by human planning or by accident or like Jesus lost control, here's what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 2, 24 through 25. Talking of Jesus, it says, when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. That is God the Father. He himself, that is Jesus, bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep. Remember, Jesus was the sheep led to the slaughter. You, like a sheep, were astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. This is not an accident. Jesus does it on purpose. In 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18, it says, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. This is otherwise known as the great exchange. That the Son of righteousness, the true Son of the Father, would give up his life for a sinner. Just thinking of other religions, what religion claims that God came and gave himself up for someone who didn't deserve it? What story have you heard where a hero dies for the villain? You and I should, to some degree, identify with Pilate as the villain. Not because you've done something so heinous that we would remember you through history as a villain or something like a villain from a cartoon or something, but because all sin is heinous and villainous in the eyes of a holy God. And yet that same holy God sent his one and only Son for you, the villain. Jesus willingly suffered and died for people who would reject him. Jesus willingly called together 12 disciples who would desert him. Jesus willingly offers to you today the ability to be reconciled to a holy God. And yet each of us is completely undeserving. How amazing is Jesus, the one true Son of the Father. He is King of the Jews. He suffered in our place. And as we'll see, he continues in the suffering with the soldiers. So Jesus, this is the last section, Jesus and the soldiers. Here's what happens next. In verse 16, and the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. When it says battalion, that's a Greek word that means about 600 people. So Jesus, who was, in kind of small parties up to this point, is now before 600 men. And these 600 men clothe him in purple. They twist together a crown of thorns that they put on his head, and they begin saluting him, "Hail, King of the Jews." So let me pause for a second. It's interesting that actually, as we continue in Mark's gospel, Jesus begins to look, as far as description, more like a king. Hear me out. In the beginning, Pilate asks, "Are you King of the Jews?" And so that's the title. And then Pilate repeats the title, and the people acknowledge the title to some degree. Yes, this is King of the Jews. They're all unknowingly affirming Jesus' true title. He is the King of the Jews they've been waiting for. And now Mark, almost like a brilliant writer, portrays Jesus now being dressed like a true king, wearing purple and having a crown, being saluted and being told, "Hail, the King of the Jews." The irony, though, is it's all in suffering. Despite the fact that they put this purple cloak on him, they put this crown of thorns on him. Isn't that a symbol of the thorns and thistles that come into the world in Genesis chapter 3? Literally, the sins of the world are being placed on Jesus' head. They say, "Hail, King of the Jews." I mean, that's the same hail that they would have given Caesar. So now they're not just mocking Jesus, which they are doing, they're also mocking the Jewish people. And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. Again, unknowingly, they are affirming the identity of Jesus. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. Jesus, up to this point, has now been beaten times and times over, something that would have killed any normal man. And yet he does not give up his life. Jesus has been crowned with the sins of the world, almost symbolically. He's been hailed as a king, and yet they don't really believe. But will you? Mark writes these things in order that you would see the true identity of Jesus and do what the soldiers, what Pilate, what the Pharisees do not. That you may have life and have it abundantly. What will you do with Jesus today? The one true Son of the Father, the King of the Jews, who suffered for you. As we transition to kind of an end or a conclusion, Christian, take courage today. Have you been persecuted or falsely accused? Have you been bullied or mocked or shamed? Have you endured physical abuse or suffering? Have you experienced the weight of the sin of the world on you in your suffering? Jesus knows what you've gone through. Eric, last week talked about, or it was 2 weeks ago, I guess, how hard it has been to go through surgeries with a net. In a very similar way, me and Eric talked a couple weeks ago about the same idea. Our daughter, me and Brittany, we have 3 kids. Nolan's our oldest. Eloa is 4, and when Eloa was about 1.5, we found out she had hip dysplasia. And so that means one of her hips was out of socket, and it needed to surgically be put back into socket. So she had multiple surgeries. She wore a body cast for, 150 plus days. I'm sure I'll find out the exact number later. It was one of the hardest things we have ever gone through, and by far one of the hardest things I have ever done is have to hand my daughter over to doctors in order for her to go behind those surgery doors. Can you imagine what the Father experienced? Giving over his one and only Son for the sins of the world. In every moment where I feel unseen, when I'm in that surgery room or when I'm dealing with other sufferings or sins in our life, Jesus knows what we've gone through. He willingly offered his life in order to suffer for you and I. He knows our suffering. That should give us joy and encouragement today that we're not just seen, we're known. We have an advocate who assures our salvation because he's gone through what we've gone through. That if you have been abused, taken advantage of by the people closest to you, so has Jesus. That's a reason to believe in him today. Will you trust in him? In the same way, if you are not a believer in this room, you should see the suffering of Jesus and the shame. You're supposed to see the shame. And yet in his shame and in his suffering, it's a reason to trust in him and believe in him. Because he did it for you. Do you recognize that? That he came and lived a life we could not live, died the death that was reserved for us, in order that we would know the Father has forgiven our sins completely, and any who believe in Jesus are alive again as Jesus is alive again in Mark chapter 16. Will you trust in him? I'm going to pray, and we're going to close the service with communion and a song. Lord, I thank you for this day. I thank you for the example of your suffering Thank you. I cannot thank you enough. I pray, Lord, you would help us today to trust in you. Help us to believe in our suffering and in our struggles that you are in control. Help us to give over the hard things in our life to you because it's only you who can handle them. I pray for anyone in this room who is going through sin or suffering today that you would help them to experience freedom. Help them to know that as Jesus is alive, so are they. And as Jesus was the one true Son, by believing in him, we are made children of the Father. And I pray, Lord, for anyone in this room who is not a believer that today they would desire to become a follower of Jesus because they understand he suffered in their place. Lord, help them to trust in Jesus today. I pray these things in your name. Amen.